"You don't belong here, you filthy animal." The words sliced through the crisp morning air outside the New York Federal Courthouse, delivered with venom by Officer Daniel Brooks. He wasn't whispering. He wanted everyone to hear, wanted his authority to echo down the marble steps like gospel truth. Judge Maya Johnson froze for a fraction of a second. She was in plain clothes today, simple blazer, no robe, no gavel, just another black woman walking up the courthouse steps. To Brooks, that was all the excuse he needed. Her briefcase, heavy with today's case files, suddenly marked her as a suspicious individual. In his eyes, she wasn't a respected jurist with 23 years on the bench. She was a target. Brooks stepped in front of her path, chest puffed, hand resting on his holster as though daring her to argue. His lips curled into a sneer as his voice carried across the steps. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The insult wasn't just meant for her. It was a performance, a declaration to the other officers nearby who began to smirk and raise their phones, recording what they assumed would be another humiliating takedown. Maya's grip tightened on her briefcase. Inside were judicial memoranda, pending case files, sensitive correspondence, the tools of justice she wielded every day. But to Brooks, they were nothing but stolen papers. He didn't see a judge, he saw prey. The weight of the moment pressed down hard. This wasn't just one officer abusing his power. This was a symbol of the systemic rot that allowed men like Brooks to weaponize their badge against the very citizens, and in this case, the very judge he was sworn to protect. And here's where you, the viewer, come in. Have you ever witnessed an injustice so blatant, so impossible to ignore, that it made your blood boil? Comment yes if you've seen something like this in your own life, or no if this is the first time you're hearing a story like it. Because what happened next would shake not just one courtroom, but the entire justice system. The slap came so fast that no one in the crowd saw it coming. Officer Daniel Brooks's open palm cracked across Maya Johnson's face with such force that her head snapped to the side. The sound echoed against the stone pillars of the courthouse like a gunshot. Her briefcase flew from her hand, papers bursting into the air and raining down onto the marble steps. Judicial orders, pending motions, legal memoranda, all scattering like confetti at a cruel parade. Before Maya could steady herself, Brooks seized her by the throat. His gloved hand pressed hard, driving her back against the cold wall of the courthouse she had served for decades. The breath caught in her chest as metal cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The sharp bite of steel against her skin was humiliating, but the smirk on Brooks's face was worse. "See that?" he barked at the gathering officers. "This is what happens when animals think they can sneak their way into places they don't belong." The others laughed, their voices mingling with the electronic chime of phones recording the scene. Officer James Carter leaned casually on the railing, muttering, "She really thought she could just walk in like she owned the place." Eric Daniels snorted in agreement, holding his phone steady to capture every second. Maya's cheek burned where the slap had landed, and her lungs ached from the pressure on her throat. But her eyes stayed locked on the bronze plaque above the courthouse door. The Honorable Judge Maya Johnson, presiding. The irony was suffocating. Just 20 feet from her own courtroom, she was reduced to a spectacle, brutalized by the very institution she represented. For the officers, it was entertainment. For Maya, it was degradation. Yet beneath the sting of humiliation, a quiet fire began to burn. She had endured the slap, the choke, the cuffs, but she would not allow this injustice to become the final word. Now, I want to ask you, have you ever seen something so openly cruel, so deliberately humiliating that it stuck with you for years? Comment yes if an injustice still haunts your memory, or no if this is your first glimpse into how blatant it can be. Because this was only the beginning. The real performance, the lies, the cover-up, the sham trial was about to begin inside those courthouse walls. Inside the grand chamber of the New York Federal Courthouse, the air was thick with authority, but not with justice. Judge Robert Allen sat high on the bench, his thin frame draped in black robes, his face already marked with the comfortable authority of someone inclined to trust the badge over the bruised woman sitting in cuffs. At the prosecution's table, Officer Daniel Brooks straightened his uniform, his chest puffed, his expression molded into the mask of a seasoned professional. The chaos of the courthouse steps had been replaced by a different theater, one where he held the script and believed the audience would never question it. "Your Honor," Brooks began, his voice calm, steady, and practiced. I was conducting routine security protocols when I observed a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security. His hand waved casually toward Maya Johnson, seated now at the defendant's table. The purple mark on her cheek was already swelling, a silent contradiction to every word he spoke. She was carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents, Brooks continued smoothly. When I approached her, she refused to identify herself and became aggressive. In the interest of public safety, I had no choice but to detain her. Prosecutor Linda Foster leaned forward, nodding with sympathetic gravity. To her, this was familiar. Another incident, another report, another story that fit the pattern she had heard dozens of times before. Officer Brooks, what did you observe about the defendant's demeanor? Brooks's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his performance. Erratic, combative. She cursed at me, made threats, even claimed she was someone important, like a judge or a senator. It's the same playbook I've seen countless times. They always try to play the victim card. From the gallery, officers James Carter and Eric Daniels exchanged smirks, their eyes flicking between each other as though to say, he's done this before. He knows how to sell it. Their phones were tucked away now, but the memory of their laughter on the courthouse steps still lingered in the room. Judge Allen nodded, scribbling notes with the kind of detached focus that suggested he had already decided which story to believe. The weight of authority sat squarely on Brooks's side. Maya sat motionless, her hands folded, her bruised face angled downward. But her silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Because every lie Brooks was stacking into place was a card waiting to collapse, and she intended to be the one to pull it down. The theater of lies continued. Brooks, emboldened by the nods of approval from Judge Robert Allen, pressed harder into his fabricated script. Each word rolled off his tongue like honey laced with venom. Your Honor, he said with feigned professionalism, the defendant was dressed inappropriately for any legitimate court proceeding. She carried papers with judicial seals and case numbers, items no ordinary citizen should possess. It looked very much like a fraud scheme. Judge Allen leaned forward, intrigued, his pen scratching across the yellow legal pad before him. Fraud scheme, you say? Yes, sir, Brooks replied, seizing the momentum. In my professional opinion, she was preparing to impersonate court personnel. I've seen it before. These individuals create elaborate ruses to gain access to restricted areas. He spoke as though he were lecturing a class, his voice brimming with false authority. From the gallery, Carter and Daniels shifted in their seats, then stood when called upon. Officer James Carter's voice was crisp, rehearsed. I corroborate Officer Brooks's account. The defendant resisted commands, tried to avoid standard security procedures, and was clearly attempting to bypass security. Eric Daniels followed quickly, eager to support the charade. And she carried confidential files. It was obvious she wasn't supposed to have them. Officer Brooks showed remarkable restraint in handling the situation. Remarkable restraint. The words stung like acid. 20 feet away, Maya Johnson sat silently, her wrists still bound in steel. She listened as her own colleagues, the very officers sworn to uphold law in her courthouse, twisted reality into a grotesque parody. The bruise on her face throbbed, but her mind was sharper than ever. Linda Foster, the prosecutor, rose to her feet. Your Honor, the state recommends charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a law enforcement officer. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is nothing more than a desperate distraction. A ripple of agreement moved through the mostly white court staff seated in the gallery. To them, this was familiar, almost comfortable. Another officer telling another story about a so-called criminal. Another narrative that fit neatly into what they'd been told for years. And there sat Maya, the true presiding judge of this courthouse, reduced to a criminal in her own courtroom, surrounded by lies so thick it seemed impossible to cut through. But in her stillness, there was no defeat. There was strategy. Every detail, every inconsistency, every reckless word spoken under oath was being catalogued in her mind. Brooks thought he was building an unassailable wall of credibility. In truth, he was handing her the tools she would soon use to tear it all down. Judge Robert Allen tapped his pen thoughtfully, his gaze locked on Officer Brooks as though the man were a trusted colleague rather than a witness under oath. Each false statement Brooks delivered landed like gospel, reinforced by the approving nods of Prosecutor Linda Foster. Officer Brooks, Allen asked, leaning slightly forward, did the defendant attempt to flee or resist arrest? Brooks's jaw tightened in just the right way. Another practice move in a performance he'd given countless times. Absolutely, Your Honor. She became physically combative when I tried to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety. The phrase hung in the air like a polished shield. Minimum necessary force. Behind it, the sting of a slap, the press of a hand around a throat, the sting of cold steel biting into skin. Maya Johnson knew exactly what those words meant. Sanitized violence. The stenographer's fingers flew across the machine, immortalizing every falsehood. In the back row, a young law clerk frowned, her memory tugging at something that didn't add up. But the rest of the room seemed entranced. Linda Foster rose again, her tone smooth, rehearsed. Your Honor, in Officer Brooks's 15 years of service, he has encountered numerous situations just like this. There's a pattern here. Individuals who refuse to follow rules, who claim discrimination as a shield when caught breaking the law. Her words found their target. Several employees in the gallery, clerks, assistants, even a few bailiffs, nodded in quiet agreement. They had seen the same headlines, the same narratives spun across the evening news. It felt familiar, comfortable, a story they could slot this moment into without question. At the defendant's table, Maya sat motionless. Her hands remained folded in her lap, the handcuffs still biting against her wrists. Her posture was calm, almost serene. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the faintest upturn at the corners of her mouth. Because while Brooks basked in what he thought was victory, Maya was doing what judges do best, taking notes. Every phrase, every embellishment, every reckless word sworn under oath was a piece of evidence. He believed he was cementing his triumph. In reality, he was laying the bricks of his own downfall. The room belonged to Brooks, for now, but Maya knew the gavel would return to its rightful hand, and when it did, justice would not whisper, it would roar. The room had settled into a rhythm that Officer Brooks controlled, his lies flowing, his allies nodding, Judge Allen indulging every word. But then, from the defendant's chair, a new voice cut through the stale air. Your Honor, Maya Johnson said, her voice clear and even. Every head turned. The calmness in her tone did not fit the image of a cornered criminal. It carried an authority that did not need to shout. Even Prosecutor Linda Foster blinked in surprise. I would like to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Brooks's testimony, Maya continued. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. That, Your Honor, is categorically false. I was walking on a public sidewalk adjacent to this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. Judge Allen raised an eyebrow. And your point? My point, Maya said, her eyes sweeping the room with deliberate precision, is that the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed that sidewalks adjoining government buildings are considered traditional public forums. Citizens have a constitutional right to be present there. In Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, the court made this explicit. The stenographer hesitated, her fingers briefly pausing. The prosecutor frowned. The gallery murmured. This was not the frantic outburst they had anticipated. It was methodical, rooted in precedent, and delivered with poise. Maya leaned slightly forward. Furthermore, Officer Brooks claimed I was carrying suspicious documents, suggesting identity theft. The papers in question are authentic legal materials, pending case files, judicial memoranda, administrative correspondence, all of which I have lawful access to in my professional capacity. There was a flicker of amusement in her eyes as she let the words linger. Professional capacity. And finally, Maya said, her voice sharpening just slightly, Officer Brooks testified that his body camera malfunctioned this morning. Yet, as this court surely knows, Rule 106 of the Federal Rules of Evidence permits introduction of summaries of voluminous records. This courthouse maintains high-definition surveillance coverage of the entrance. The county also maintains automatic cloud backups of all officer body cam footage. The color drained from Brooks's face. He had forgotten about the cameras. Maya turned toward Judge Allen. Your Honor, I respectfully request that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from 8:45 to 9:15 a.m. this morning, including courthouse cameras, body cam backups, and mobile recordings made by officers present. For the first time that morning, silence reigned in the chamber. Not the comfortable silence of belief in Brooks, but the heavy silence of doubt. And to you watching this unfold, If you believe video evidence is the single most powerful tool against lies in court, hit the like button right now. Maya wasn't finished. She had just begun. The silence that followed Maya Johnson's request was electric. For the first time since Officer Brooks began his performance, the courtroom felt uncertain. Then, Prosecutor Linda Foster stood abruptly, her voice sharp, almost desperate. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, her words clipped. "The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. This entire line of request is improper." Judge Robert Allen leaned back in his chair, nodding slightly as though relieved to hear the objection. It gave him a reason to dismiss the unsettling calm radiating from the woman in handcuffs. But Maya's eyes never wavered. Slowly, deliberately, she turned to face the prosecutor, her voice steady as stone. "Your Honor, pro se defendants are constitutionally permitted to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. That includes making requests to preserve potentially exculpatory material." Her gaze locked onto Foster until the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, retreating half a step without meaning to. "And as you are certainly aware," Maya continued, her tone cooling, "Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve and disclose any evidence that may be favorable to the defense. Failure to do so constitutes a violation of due process." The words hung heavy in the chamber. This was not the language of desperation. It was the precise, measured cadence of someone deeply familiar with the system, a system that suddenly looked less certain, less controlled. The young law clerk in the back sat up straighter. She knew that voice, that manner. Not the defendant of Brooks's story, but someone who belonged in command of a courtroom. Even Judge Allen hesitated. "Miss Johnson," he said slowly, "you seem unusually well-versed in legal procedure." "I have some experience," Maya replied neutrally, though the corner of her mouth threatened a smile. Around the room, tension thickened. The officers shifted uneasily. Brooks's confidence wavered, and the gallery, once so eager to nod along, now leaned forward in quiet disbelief. The woman in handcuffs was not who they thought she was. And to you, watching this story unfold, if you believe knowledge of the law is the most powerful weapon against injustice, comment "justice" below. Let the world know you stand with truth over lies. Maya had taken the first piece of ground back, and the cracks in Brooks's wall of lies were beginning to spread. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Allen declared, though his voice carried a nervous quiver he couldn't conceal. As the bailiff moved to escort Maya toward the holding room, Thomas Miller's eyes fell on her face. For a moment he froze, the color draining from his cheeks. He had worked this courthouse for over a decade, seen every judge pass through its doors, and suddenly recognition hit him like a blow. "Judge Johnson?" he whispered under his breath, almost dropping his keys. Maya's steady eyes met his. There was no need for confirmation, but she gave him a small nod anyway. Miller's mouth went dry. "Jesus Christ. Judge Johnson, I didn't recognize you in plain clothes. I thought—" His words faltered. "It's all right, Thomas," Maya said softly, the first warmth he had heard from her since the morning began. "You weren't part of this, but now I need your help." Anything, Your Honor," Miller replied instantly, his voice thick with guilt and determination. "I need you to go to my chambers quietly," Maya instructed, her voice low but commanding. "Bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim, and bring my gavel, the engraved one from my swearing-in." Miller nodded so vigorously his keys rattled. "Yes, Your Honor, right away." He hurried out, leaving Maya in the small holding room. Alone, she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. For 23 years she had walked into courtrooms draped in the authority of the robe. That morning, stripped of it, she had been reduced to a defendant, humiliated and brutalized. But now it was time to reclaim her place. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, returned to her after booking. Dozens of missed calls and texts lit the screen. Her clerk, her staff, other attorneys demanding to know why she hadn't taken the bench. She typed quickly, steady hands despite the bruise darkening across her cheek. "Clear my calendar. Something more important has come up." Then she scrolled until she found the number she needed. Chief Judge Eleanor White answered on the second ring. "Catherine," she said quickly, using Maya's given name, "we heard there was an incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better," Maya replied evenly. But I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions. Eleanor's voice hardened. Consider it done. Contact courthouse security. Preserve every frame of surveillance footage between 8:45 and 9:15 this morning. Multiple copies in different locations. Then start pulling every case Daniel Brooks has touched in the last 5 years. I want them all reviewed. There was a pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Oh my God. What did he do? Maya's lips curved into a grim smile. He thought he arrested a criminal this morning. In truth, he assaulted a federal judge, and in 10 minutes he's going to learn exactly what that means. The murmur of voices filled the courtroom as the 15-minute recess dragged on. Prosecutor Linda Foster shuffled papers with unnecessary force, trying to project confidence. Officer Daniel Brooks leaned casually against the prosecutor's table, a smirk tugging at his lips as if the case was already sealed. Judge Robert Allen fidgeted in the high-backed chair, scribbling on his pad, trying to convince himself he still controlled the proceedings. Then the heavy oak door behind the bench swung open. All rise! Bailiff Thomas Miller's voice boomed, louder and steadier than anyone had ever heard it. The command cracked through the chamber like thunder, silencing every whisper. Chairs scraped and feet shuffled as the entire courtroom obeyed out of instinct. And then she appeared. Maya Johnson stepped through the doorway, draped in her flowing black judicial robe trimmed with gold. The fabric caught the light as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. In her right hand, she carried the engraved gavel from her swearing-in ceremony, its polished wood gleaming beneath the overhead lamps. The effect was electric. Officer Brooks, mid-smirk, went rigid. His face drained from red to chalk white. Judge Allen, still in what he now realized was her chair, froze like a man staring at a ghost. Linda Foster's pen slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. The gallery, packed with clerks and staff, erupted in shocked whispers that quickly gave way to stunned silence. Maya moved slowly, deliberately, down the short steps and to the bench. Her bench. Every measured stride declared what words did not need to. This is my courtroom. I belong here. And you, every single one of you, forgot that truth. She seated herself behind the bench, lifting the gavel and placing it on the sound block with a quiet tap that reverberated louder than Brooks's slap hours earlier. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in every shocked expression, every jaw gone slack, every officer suddenly uncertain of their footing. "Officer Brooks," she said, her voice quiet but laced with the full weight of judicial authority, "you may remain standing." Brooks's knees shook beneath him. His mouth opened, but no words came. The power dynamic of the entire day had flipped in an instant. And for the first time since sunrise, justice sat where it belonged. The silence was suffocating. Every eye in the chamber locked onto the woman, now seated in the presiding judge's chair. The robe transformed Maya Johnson from defendant to sovereign authority, and the contrast was almost unbearable for those who had laughed at her only minutes before. "Officer Brooks," Maya said, her tone precise and cool. "Approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Brooks swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Yes, Your Honor." "Good," Maya replied, folding her hands on the bench. "Let me refresh your memory. You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Brooks's lips parted, but only a weak nod followed. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice slicing through the stillness. "You also described me as another entitled activist looking for a payday. You insisted you had seen this playbook before. Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brooks stammered, the words barely audible. "And perhaps most memorably," Maya continued, her eyes narrowing, "you told this court that people like me need to learn that actions have consequences. Do you recall offering that particular piece of wisdom?" Brooks's legs shook so violently he had to grip the edge of the prosecutor's table to remain upright. Sweat glistened at his temple. The smirk that had decorated his face during recess was gone, replaced by panic. The gallery sat frozen, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the silence. Maya reached under the bench and retrieved a tablet, holding it up for the courtroom to see. "Officer Brooks, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who knew the truth was about to detonate like a bomb. "This footage," she said, tapping the screen, "is from courthouse security camera number 7. It provides an unobstructed view of the main entrance this morning. The tablet flickered to life, the video already cued. The courtroom braced itself. And to you watching this unfold, if you believe liars should always be confronted with their own words, drop a comment below saying, "Truth always wins." The unraveling was about to begin. The screen lit up, pulling every gaze toward the tablet in Judge Maya Johnson's hand. With one touch, the silent dread in the room gave way to the harsh clarity of recorded truth. There she was, Maya herself, walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes, her briefcase steady at her side. Then, clear as day, Brooks stepped into her path, his posture aggressive, his voice cutting through the speakers. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The words were no longer rumors, no longer hearsay. They were preserved in pixels and sound waves, undeniable. The video played on. Brooks's hand shot out, slapping Maya so hard her head whipped sideways. The courtroom collectively flinched at the impact. They watched as he slammed her against the stone wall, fingers tightening around her throat, and then came the words that sealed his fate. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The venom in his tone echoed off the chamber walls. Several clerks in the gallery recoiled, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disgust. On screen, the scattered papers danced in the wind, evidence of who Maya truly was, a judge with case files in hand, treated as a criminal. The officer's laughter punctuated the cruelty, captured by the cameras that Brooks had conveniently forgotten. Maya paused the video. Her eyes never left Brooks, whose face was now ashen, his bravado dissolved into trembling silence. "Officer Brooks," she said evenly, "do you see any verbal aggression from the so-called defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Brooks's lips moved, but no sound emerged. The courtroom waited, but the silence said more than any excuse ever could. Maya's tone grew colder. "You told this court a story built on lies, but the cameras, your cameras, tell another. This footage shows not restraint, but unprovoked violence. Not professionalism, but prejudice. And not law enforcement, but lawlessness." The gallery stirred, the tide shifting fully now. No one could deny what they had just witnessed. And to you, if you believe video evidence is the ultimate weapon against injustice, hit that like button right now. Let's make sure lies never outrun the truth. The wall Brooks had built around himself was crumbling, and the collapse had only just begun. The silence after the courthouse video was suffocating. Officer Daniel Brooks stood like a man whose uniform had turned to chains, his swagger replaced by terror. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't finished. She lifted the tablet again, her expression calm, deliberate. "Now," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber, "let us examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned this morning." Brooks's eyes widened. His lips parted as though to protest, but no sound came. Maya's fingers swiped across the screen, revealing a new file. "This," she continued, "is the automatic cloud backup from your own body cam, uploaded every 60 seconds to the county's secure servers. A system you apparently forgot existed." The video began to play. From Brooks's own perspective, the courtroom watched the brutal reality unfold. The camera caught his approach, his sneer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at this uppity one, thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. These people need to learn their place." The chamber gasped. The words were sharper, uglier than anyone had imagined, and there it was, captured not by a bystander, not by security, but by Brooks himself. On screen, his hand struck Maya, his grip tightened around her throat. His voice snarled again, "Time to teach another lesson." The gallery stirred with revulsion. Several jurors waiting for other cases stood and walked out, their disgust too great to contain. Prosecutor Linda Foster scrambled to collect her papers, her face flushed crimson. The carefully crafted narrative was collapsing into ash before her eyes. Maya paused the video, her tone quiet but lethal. "Officer Brooks, you testified under oath that the defendant became combative, that you used the minimum necessary force. Yet your own body cam shows you initiating the assault, accompanied by words of racial hatred. How do you reconcile this with the testimony you swore before this court?" Brooks's knees buckled. He clutched the edge of the prosecutor's table, his voice strangled. But the words died in his throat. "And to you, watching this story, if you believe no excuse can erase the truth once it's captured, drop a comment below saying, 'The camera never lies.'" Maya set the tablet down. The case Brooks thought he controlled was no longer his. His own evidence had turned executioner. The tablet still glowed on the bench, its screen frozen on Brooks's body cam footage. His hand raised, his voice snarling hate. The courtroom could barely breathe, but Judge Maya Johnson was not finished. She shifted her gaze away from Brooks, scanning the gallery until her eyes locked on two other men in uniform. "Officer James Carter, Officer Eric Daniels," she said evenly. "Both of you testified under oath that Officer Brooks handled the situation with what you called remarkable professionalism." Carter stiffened in his seat. Daniels's eyes darted toward the exit. The room seemed to tilt in their direction, all attention shifting to the men who had nodded and smirked while Brooks spun his lies. Maya tapped the screen again, advancing the footage. The sound of Carter's own voice filled the chamber. She really thought she could just walk in like she owned the place. Laughter followed. Daniels's laughter. Then came another line, casual and cruel. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system. The words hung like poison in the air. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some clerks exchanged horrified glances. Others stared at the officers with open disgust. "Remarkable professionalism?" Maya repeated, her voice like a blade. "Is that what this court is meant to call it, when officers mock and laugh while a woman is brutalized on the courthouse steps? Is that what you swore under oath?" Neither man spoke. Carter's throat worked, but no sound came. Daniels shifted, edging an inch closer to the door, as if he could escape the weight of the evidence crushing him. Maya leaned forward, her eyes burning with authority. "Both of you committed perjury in this courtroom today. Both of you chose to reinforce a lie rather than uphold the law you swore to protect, and you did so knowing full well what had occurred outside these doors." The gallery stirred with anger, murmurs swelling into condemnation. The tide had turned completely. No longer was Brooks the lone villain. His allies were exposed, their complicity undeniable. And to you, if you believe silence in the face of injustice makes you guilty too, share this video. Let others see that complicity always carries consequences. Carter and Daniels sat frozen, the weight of justice pressing down on them. What had started as laughter on the courthouse steps was now evidence that could end their careers and possibly their freedom. The courtroom buzzed with unease. Carter and Daniels sat pale and stiff, their silence as damning as the footage, replaying in everyone's minds. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't finished tightening the noose. She shifted her gaze back to Brooks, who looked ready to collapse. "Officer Brooks," Maya said, her voice like ice, "in the footage we've seen today, what crime did you actually commit?" Brooks' mouth opened, but no answer came. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an ally, a lifeline, but the prosecutor was frantically gathering her papers, her face flushed. Judge Robert Allen, now standing awkwardly to the side, seemed smaller by the second. Maya let the silence stretch, then struck. "Let me be clear. You did not simply assault a citizen. You did not simply detain someone unlawfully. You committed felony assault against a federal judge while she was performing her official duties." The words dropped like thunder. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers, some people gasping aloud. Bailiffs stiffened, realizing for the first time that they had watched a colleague strike not just a woman, but the presiding judge of the very courthouse they served. Maya rose slightly from her chair, the black robe flowing around her like armor. "For 23 years, I have sat on this bench. Every case you have ever testified in, every warrant you have ever requested, every search you've conducted within this jurisdiction has passed under my authority. And this morning, you chose to lay hands on me as if I were nothing." She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Brooks swayed where he stood, his knees buckling, his hand gripping the table for support. "You thought you were teaching a lesson?" Maya continued, her voice steady and sharp. "But the only lesson taught here today is that no one is above the law. Not even a man with a badge." The room was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence of realization. Every person present now understood the gravity of what they had witnessed. And to you, if you believe no one should ever be above the law, no officer, no judge, no politician, type equal justice in the comments. Let the world know you stand with accountability. The mask was gone. The smirk was gone. And for the first time in his career, Brooks understood what true authority felt like because it was standing in front of him in a black robe holding a gavel. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, every breath audible, every heartbeat pounding in unison. Officer Daniel Brooks stood trembling, his face pale, sweat dripping down his temples. He had thought this morning was routine. Another lie spun, another black body humiliated, another story rewritten by the badge. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her gavel resting on the bench like a loaded weapon. "Officer Brooks, there's something you didn't know when you laid hands on me this morning." Brooks's eyes flickered with desperation, but Maya's gaze pinned him in place. "For the past 6 months," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "I have been working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice, and the State Attorney General's Office. Together, we have been investigating systemic patterns of misconduct and racial bias within your department." The gallery stirred. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. The officers who had laughed earlier now sat frozen, realizing the ground beneath them was collapsing. Maya's eyes never left Brooks. "You weren't simply unlucky today, Officer Brooks. You've been under investigation. Every arrest, every complaint, every testimony you've given in the past 5 years has been under review." Brooks's jaw dropped. His body seemed to fold in on itself, shoulders sagging as if crushed by the revelation. "And this morning," Maya continued, her tone cold and deliberate, "you provided us with the single most perfect piece of evidence we could have ever hoped for. Your actions, your words, your lies under oath, they confirm exactly what the investigation suspected." She paused, letting the weight of the moment suffocate him. "When you called me a filthy animal, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you didn't just commit an act of brutality. You delivered proof. Ironclad proof that will now bring your entire career crashing down." The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur of disbelief, anger, and awe. Maya raised her gavel slightly, her voice cutting through the noise. "You were right about one thing, Officer Brooks. Actions do have consequences, and yours will be remembered as the day justice finally came for you. And to you watching, if you believe corrupt officers should always face the full weight of federal justice, hit share right now. Let's make sure the world hears this story." Brooks's head dropped into his hands, his smirk, his swagger, his shield of lies, gone. And for the first time in his life, he realized justice had teeth. The weight of Maya's revelation still pressed down on the chamber, but she was not finished. With measured calm, she reached beneath the bench and pulled out a thick manila folder, its edges worn from weeks of preparation. She set it on the desk with a firm thud that echoed louder than Brooks's hollow testimony ever had. "Officer Brooks," Maya began, her voice steady, "you may believe this morning was an isolated mistake, a single lapse in judgment, but the record tells a different story." She flipped open the folder, the rustle of paper cutting through the silence. "According to Internal Affairs, you have been the subject of 47 formal complaints during your 15 years in law enforcement." 47. Gasps broke out across the gallery. Brooks's attorney, hastily assigned at recess, scribbled furiously, but his face betrayed hopelessness. Maya held up the first document. "Complaint number 1, 2009. Mrs. Rosa Delgado, a 63-year-old grandmother, alleged that you called her a racial slur during a traffic stop, then slammed her face into the hood of her car when she asked for your badge number. The department's conclusion? Unsubstantiated." She turned a page. "Complaint number 12, 2012. Jamal Harris, a 17-year-old honor student, claimed you planted drugs in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his brother. Again, unsubstantiated." The courtroom stirred. Several clerks shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to one another, recognizing the names from old case files. Maya's voice sharpened as she flipped further. "Complaint number 23, 2016. Dr. Michael Reynolds, a respected cardiologist, alleged you arrested him outside his own home because you refused to believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. He spent 6 hours in jail before his attorney secured his release. What did the department conclude?" Unsubstantiated. Her eyes bored into Brooks, whose shoulders hunched lower with every word. "Do you see the pattern, Officer Brooks?" Maya asked, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Year after year, complaint after complaint, dismissed, buried, ignored. Yet here you stand, claiming professionalism." The courtroom was utterly still, every person holding their breath as Maya closed the file with a decisive snap. "And to you, if you believe ignored complaints are not unsubstantiated, but a warning ignored, Type "no more excuses" in the comments. Let's expose the pattern, not protect it. The truth was clear now. Brooks wasn't a man who made one mistake. He was a man built on years of unpunished misconduct, and the reckoning had finally arrived. The thick file still lay open on the bench, its pages filled with complaints and broken trust. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't satisfied with anecdotes. She reached for a second binder, thicker, heavier, marked with neat tabs. With practiced precision, she opened it and set a large chart on the easel beside her bench. "Officer Brooks," Maya began, her voice crisp, "let us move from testimony and complaints to hard data. Numbers don't lie, they cannot be spun, and they will not bend to your narrative." She pointed to the first section of the chart with a laser pointer. "Over your 15-year career, you have made 1,949 arrests. Of those, 1,089, 87% involved people of color. 87% in a patrol area whose population demographics are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Several court staff leaned forward, their eyes widening as the numbers sank in. Maya continued, her tone unwavering. "Your use of force reports tell an equally damning story. In 63% of your arrests involving people of color, you used physical force. In contrast, with white suspects, that number drops to 12%. The room grew tense, the weight of the disparity pressing into every corner. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word, every figure. "And perhaps most damning of all," Maya said, flipping to another page, "of your 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 cases, nearly 40%, were dismissed. Dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or constitutional violations. Nearly half, Officer Brooks. That is not law enforcement. That is systemic abuse." Brooks's attorney sank deeper into his chair, his pen still, but his eyes wide with disbelief. Brooks himself shook his head faintly, as though denial could erase the numbers now seared into the record. Maya's eyes locked on him. "Do you know what we call it when an officer produces a 40% dismissal rate tied to constitutional violations? We call it a pattern of criminal behavior." The gallery erupted in whispers, the tide of disgust undeniable. "And to you watching, if you believe statistics tell the truth that excuses try to hide, hit share now. Let others see the numbers that prove systemic injustice." The lies Brooks built his career upon had been dismantled, first by testimony, then by footage, and now by the cold, merciless clarity of math. The numbers on the easel still glowed under the projector light, every percentage a blade cutting through Brooks's last defenses. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't finished. She reached into the binder again and pulled out another stack of documents, thicker, heavier, bound with a red ribbon. "This court has seen the human cost of Officer Brooks's misconduct," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "But now, let us examine the financial cost, the burden you have forced this community to bear." She held up the first sheet. "Over the past 15 years, this county has paid out $2.3 million in settlements and judgments directly tied to your conduct, Officer Brooks." The gallery gasped. A few jurors waiting for other cases audibly muttered in disbelief. Reporters' pens scratched faster. Maya continued, flipping page after page. $2.3 million. That is more than the entire annual budget of some small towns. Money that should have funded schools, hospitals, housing initiatives, drained away to cover the wreckage left behind by your abuse of authority? Her gavel tapped once, sharp against the wood. "And it doesn't end there. The cases pending review, the ones your misconduct tainted, may cost millions more. Every unconstitutional arrest, every fabricated testimony, every life you trampled on could add to that bill." She let the words sink in, her eyes sweeping across the gallery. "Let us be clear. These payouts are not just numbers on a page. They represent families torn apart, careers destroyed, reputations ruined, and the taxpayers, hard-working men and women of this county, have been forced to pay the price for your crimes." Brooks's shoulders slumped lower, the weight of his failures pressing down visibly. His attorney rubbed his forehead, clearly calculating years of prison time and civil liability that loomed over his client's head. Maya leaned forward. "Officer Brooks, do you understand? Your actions didn't just damage individuals, they bled an entire community. You turned the badge from a shield of trust into a drain on the very people you swore to protect." The gallery sat in stunned silence. Then a murmur rose, a tide of anger and disgust swelling into the air. And to you, if you believe taxpayers should never pay for the crimes of corrupt officers, comment, "Make them pay" below. Let's demand accountability where it belongs. The message was clear. Brooks's brutality wasn't just violence, it was theft. Theft of dignity, of trust, and of millions in public money. And now the bill had come due. The red ribbon file still lay open, its pages filled with settlements and dollar signs, each one a scar on the community. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't finished. She reached beneath the bench again and lifted a single official document sealed with the emblem of the police department. "Officer Brooks," she said, her tone sharp yet deliberate, "on the day you pinned that badge to your chest, you swore an oath. Do you remember the words?" Brooks's lips trembled, his face ashen. He shook his head faintly, unable or unwilling to answer. Maya held up the document. "Then allow me to refresh your memory." She began to read aloud, her voice resonant, cutting through the chamber with the weight of authority. "I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office to the best of my ability. So help me God." The words rang out like a prayer twisted into irony. The gallery sat frozen, the silence oppressive. Maya lowered the page slowly, her eyes pierced through Brooks, holding him captive. "Faithfully, impartially, those were the promises you made. And yet, your record shows nothing but selective enforcement, racial prejudice, and systemic abuse. You did not support the Constitution, you shredded it. You did not defend the people, you preyed upon them. You did not discharge your duties with faith, you defiled the oath you swore." Brooks's head sank lower into his chest. The badge pinned to his uniform no longer looked like honor. It looked like evidence. Maya stepped out from behind the bench, holding the oath in one hand and her gavel in the other. "The Constitution is not a suggestion. It is not a tool to be applied when convenient or ignored when inconvenient. It is the foundation of justice. And you, Officer Brooks, built a career on betraying it." Her voice rose, passion lacing every word. "Today, this courtroom witnesses the difference between the words you swore and the deeds you carried out, and it will be remembered, long after your badge is stripped away, that you failed not just the people, but the very promise that gave you authority. And to you watching, if you believe every oath must be honored, especially by those with power, type 'honor the oath' in the comments. Let's remind the world that words mean nothing without integrity." The oath that once symbolized Brooks's duty now stood as the clearest proof of his betrayal. The oath still trembled in Maya Johnson's hand, the inked words that once carried solemn promise, now nothing more than evidence of betrayal. She placed it gently on the bench, then lifted her gaze to the gallery, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. Clerks, reporters, attorneys, officers, citizens. "This morning has revealed more than the corruption of one man," she began, her voice strong, steady. "Officer Brooks is not an outlier. He is not an isolated mistake in an otherwise perfect system. He is the inevitable product of a culture that protects power at all costs." The gallery stirred, her words striking deeper than statistics ever could. For 15 years, complaint after complaint was dismissed as unsubstantiated. 47 voices, grandmothers, teenagers, doctors, ignored, silenced, erased. 47 warnings that the system chose not to hear. Her tone sharpened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Instead of protecting the people, this system protected him. Instead of seeking truth, it sought excuses. And while it shielded him, communities paid in blood, in trust, in dollars stolen from their future. Maya leaned forward, her robe flowing around her like armor. This is what happens when accountability is treated as optional, when misconduct is brushed aside as paperwork, when institutions value loyalty over justice. She gestured toward Brooks, who sat slumped in the defendant's chair, a hollowed shell of the man who had strutted through the courthouse hours earlier. "Look at him. This is what unchecked power creates: arrogance, cruelty, impunity. But let us be clear, he did not create this system. He was nurtured by it, enabled by it, protected by it." The silence in the room thickened, no one daring to move. Reporters bent lower over their notepads, desperate to capture every word. "And today?" Maya continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried further than a shout. We send a message to every officer, every supervisor, every official who thinks the shield of the system will always save them. That shield has shattered. The days of impunity are over. The gavel hovered above her bench, a symbol of both judgment and renewal. And to you, if you believe the system itself must be held accountable, not just the individuals it protects, share this story right now. Let's tear down the walls that enable injustice. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing the downfall of one man. It was witnessing the beginning of something far larger, the reckoning of a system that had failed for far too long. The murmurs in the gallery swelled, rising like a tide of outrage, but Judge Maya Johnson lifted her gavel once, a single sharp crack restoring silence. Her gaze returned to Brooks, hunched and trembling, his once polished uniform now nothing more than a costume unraveling thread by thread. Officer Brooks, she said, her voice deliberate and unflinching, you have spent your career telling others to know their place. This morning, you used those very words on me, convinced that your badge gave you the authority to define my worth, my presence, my humanity. Her words cut through him like steel. He lifted his head slightly, eyes bloodshot, mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. Maya leaned forward, her robe pooling like a shadow around her. But let me be perfectly clear. Your place is not behind a badge. Your place is not wielding authority over citizens you despise. Your place is not in the seat of power you so freely abused. She pointed slowly toward the wooden chair where Brooks now sat, once reserved for defendants awaiting judgment. Your place is here, in that chair, answering for 15 years of brutality, lies, and perjury. Your place is as the accused, facing the full consequences of the crimes you committed under the guise of law. The words landed with the force of a verdict. The gallery shifted, the weight of the declaration pulling everyone tighter into the moment. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Maya's voice dropped lower, but every syllable struck like thunder. You mistook your badge for immunity, but a badge is not a shield from justice. It is a responsibility to uphold it. And when you betray that responsibility, when you weaponize it against the very people you swore to protect, the only place left for you is in the defendant's chair. Brooks's head fell into his hands. His shoulders heaved once, twice, the reality crushing him. The uniform no longer looked like authority. It looked like evidence. And to you, if you believe abusers of power should sit where the accused belong, comment, no badge above justice. Let the world know that the defendant's chair is the only place for corruption. The courtroom no longer saw Brooks as an officer. They saw him for what he truly was, a criminal awaiting judgment. The defendant's chair creaked under Brooks's weight as he slumped, defeated, the once confident officer now reduced to a trembling shadow of himself. Judge Maya Johnson let the silence linger, allowing the image to sear itself into every mind in the room. Then she rose, her robe flowing like a banner of authority, and turned her attention not just to Brooks, but to everyone present. This morning began with one man's arrogance, she said, her voice steady, carrying to the farthest corners of the gallery. But what we have witnessed here is not merely the fall of Officer Brooks. What we have witnessed is what happens when unchecked power collides with accountability. Her gaze swept the rows. Clerks with wide eyes, attorneys scribbling furiously, citizens leaning forward on the edge of their seats. For years, this courtroom has processed cases where truth was twisted, where authority dictated reality. Today, we saw the opposite. Authority stripped bare, lies dismantled, truth undeniable. Maya walked a slow, deliberate step forward from the bench, every movement commanding the room. The badge does not grant supremacy. The robe does not guarantee immunity. The office does not excuse corruption. Power without accountability is not protection. It is tyranny. The words struck like hammer blows. Several people in the gallery nodded. Others murmured agreement, their voices low but fervent. And to those who wonder if today is an anomaly, Maya continued, let this be the answer. No one, no officer, no judge, no politician is beyond the reach of justice. When power is abused, justice will not only catch up, justice will strike back. Her hand lifted the gavel slightly, the light glinting off its engraved handle. This case is not just about a man who forgot his oath. It is about a system that must remember its own, and today marks the beginning of that remembrance. The room pulsed with energy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her words. And to you, if you believe justice must always outlast corruption, hit share right now. Let's remind the world that accountability is not optional, it is inevitable. Maya returned to the bench, her robe settling around her, the embodiment of the message she had just delivered. Power without accountability is nothing. The air in the chamber was thick, every person present bracing for what would come next. Judge Maya Johnson's robe seemed to ripple with each movement as she settled back onto her bench. The gavel rested firmly in her hand, no longer just a symbol of authority, but the instrument of truth itself. "Officer Daniel Brooks," she began, her voice ringing with precision, "you came into this courtroom today believing you held the power to control the narrative. You believed your badge would outweigh the truth. You believed your lies would be recorded as fact. But now, we arrive at the moment where belief gives way to law." Brooks twitched, his face pale, his eyes darting to his trembling attorney who had no words of comfort left. Maya lifted a document from the bench, crisp and official. "This court now places before you the charges that reflect your actions, your words, and your abuse of power." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. The gallery leaned forward as though holding its breath. "First, assault in the first degree. You struck, choked, and brutalized a woman without provocation. That woman happened to be a federal judge, but even if she had not been, the act itself is a violent crime punishable by law." The gavel tapped once, sharp and final. "Second, assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony. You laid hands on the very person entrusted to uphold justice, and by doing so, you attacked the integrity of this entire institution." The gavel tapped again. "Third, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. By your own words, captured on video and confirmed by your body camera, you acted not out of duty, but out of racial prejudice. That is a federal felony, carrying up to 10 years in prison." Brooks shuddered visibly. "And finally," Maya said, her voice deepening, "perjury in the first degree. You stood in this courtroom, placed your hand on the truth, and lied under oath. Every word you spoke was a weapon meant to bury justice. Today, those lies bury only you." The gavel struck a third time, louder, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap through the chamber. "And to you, if you believe lies under oath should always lead to consequences, comment, 'Perjury is a crime,' below. Let's remind the world that truth in court is sacred." Maya's eyes bore into Brooks. The charges were no longer abstract, they were chains already wrapping around him, pulling him down into the seat he so desperately wanted to avoid. The echo of the gavel still reverberated through the chamber, its thunderclap lingering in every chest. Daniel Brooks sat crushed in the defendant's chair, his eyes hollow, his body bent under the weight of his own downfall. But Judge Maya Johnson wasn't finished, not with him, and not with the system that had carried him this far. She rose from the bench, her robe flowing as she stepped forward, every eye following her as though she were gravity itself. "This morning," she said, her voice steady, "many believed this case was about one officer, one confrontation, one so-called criminal." Her hand cut through the air. "But this was never just about Daniel Brooks. This is about the culture that allowed Daniel Brooks to exist." The gallery stirred, murmurs of agreement and realization rippling through the crowd. Reporters' pens scratched frantically, knowing they were capturing a speech that would echo far beyond these walls. "For too long," Maya continued, her voice rising, "our justice system has looked the other way when complaints pile up. 47 times Brooks was accused of misconduct. 47 times the system said unsubstantiated. Those words did not mean innocent. They meant ignored. They meant unheard. They meant a voice crying out in the dark with no one willing to listen." She turned her gaze to the rows of uniformed officers seated stiffly along the wall. And every time those voices were silenced, every time accountability was denied, men like Brooks grew bolder. The badge became not a shield of protection, but a license for abuse. Maya's voice dropped, quieter now, but sharper, more dangerous. "This court will not allow that license to exist any longer. This judgment is not only a verdict on Brooks, it is an indictment of a system that enabled him, a system that must now be torn down, examined, and rebuilt." The silence was absolute, the air charged with the weight of history. "And to you, if you believe entire systems must change, not just individuals, type systemic reform, In the comments, let's remind the world that justice is bigger than one man. Judge Maya Johnson stepped back toward the bench. The message was unmistakable. This case had outgrown Daniel Brooks. It had become a turning point for the entire system. The chamber was utterly still, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Judge Maya Johnson stood tall behind her bench, her gavel raised, her eyes locked on the man who had once strutted with impunity. Daniel Brooks no longer looked like an officer. He looked like what he had always been, a criminal awaiting judgment. "Officer Brooks," Maya began, her voice steady but heavy with finality. "This court finds you guilty of assault in the first degree, a violent felony, guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying mandatory prison time, guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a felony punishable by years behind bars, and guilty of perjury for lying under oath in this very courtroom." The words struck like hammer blows. Brooks flinched with each charge, his attorney burying his face in his hands. Maya continued, her tone unyielding. "For these crimes, and for the years of brutality, misconduct, and corruption you represent, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some clerks clapped their hands to their mouths. A reporter whispered, "History," under her breath. Maya struck the gavel once, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap of justice. "Furthermore," she declared, "this court orders a federal review of every case you touched, every defendant you arrested, every conviction secured by your testimony. The victims silenced for 15 years will have their voices heard." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the stunned faces of officers, lawyers, and citizens. "Let this judgment serve notice to every official who believes the system will protect them. The days of impunity are over. Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied." The gallery erupted, not in chaos but in thunderous applause. For 5 full minutes the courthouse shook with the sound of vindication. Brooks sat motionless, broken by the reality he could no longer escape. Maya lifted her gavel one final time. "Justice is blind," she said, her voice carrying to every corner, "but she sees everything, and today she saw you. And to you, if you believe justice must always prevail, hit subscribe, share this story, and comment "Justice Delivered." Let the world know that truth will always rise, and no badge, no robe, no title can stand above it. The gavel came down with a crack like thunder. Justice had spoken, and this time she had spoken for everyone.